If Hitler had died in September 1939, Nazi Germany might actually have won World War II. And that's not speculation. That's what military historians have been quietly saying for decades. September 1st, 1939. German tanks are rolling into Poland. The invasion is going exactly according to plan. But 3 days later, Adolf Hitler collapses in his office. Massive heart attack. He's dead within an hour. The Nazi regime doesn't collapse. The generals don't surrender. Instead, something far more dangerous happens. The military takes control. And suddenly, Germany has leadership that actually knows how to wage war. Today, we're diving into the most disturbing alternate history scenario that historians actually take seriously. Because when you remove Hitler's catastrophic decision-making from World War II, everything changes. Here's the thing nobody wants to admit. Hitler was terrible at military strategy. Like genuinely terrible. He made decision after decision that cost Germany the war. And the German generals knew it. They watched him throw away victory after victory because of his ego, his ideology, and his complete refusal to listen to anyone who actually understood warfare. But what if he wasn't there to make those mistakes? September 1939. Hitler is dead. The Nazi party structure is still intact. The Wehrmacht, the German military, is at the peak of its power. They've just crushed Poland in less than a month. The generals who actually planned that victory are now in charge. And they're not ideologues. They're professionals. Cold, calculating, and terrifyingly competent. The power vacuum begins immediately. You've got Hermann Göring, chief of the Luftwaffe, who technically should be next in line. You've got Heinrich Himmler, who runs the SS, with his own private army. And you've got the Wehrmacht generals, the actual military leadership, who think both of these guys are clowns. In our timeline, this kind of power struggle would be chaos. But here's what makes this scenario so chilling. The generals win. Not because they're better politicians, but because they control the actual military. The tanks, the troops, the weapons. Göring is a drug addict who prefers stealing art to running a country. Himmler is terrifying, but he's an administrator, not a strategist. The generals look at both of them and basically say, we're about to fight France and Britain in a few months. We need people who know what they're doing. So a military council takes power. Maybe it's led by Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command. Maybe it's Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff. Maybe it's a committee. Doesn't matter. What matters is that for the first time, Nazi Germany is being run by people who understand military reality. And that's where it becomes absolutely terrifying. Let's start with the obvious question. What happens when Germany invades France in 1940? In our timeline, Hitler enabled this invasion, but he also nearly destroyed it. The plan to attack through the Ardennes forest to bypass the Maginot Line, that was actually the general's idea. Specifically, Erich von Manstein's idea. Hitler approved it, but then constantly interfered. He delayed the invasion multiple times. He redirected forces based on hunches. And most critically, he ordered the tanks to stop at Dunkirk. That last one is huge. May 1940. The British Expeditionary Force is trapped on the beaches at Dunkirk. German tanks are 10 miles away. They can cut off the entire British army, capture hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and knock Britain out of the war before it really begins. And Hitler orders the tanks to stop. For 2 days. He thinks the infantry should finish the job. He thinks the tanks need maintenance. He thinks the terrain is bad. He's wrong on all counts. Because of that halt order, 338,000 Allied soldiers escaped to Britain. The British army survives. Churchill can continue to fight. The war continues. Now imagine there's no Hitler to issue that order. The tanks don't stop. They reach Dunkirk on May 22nd, before the British can organize an evacuation. The Luftwaffe doesn't waste resources bombing empty beaches. Instead, German panzers surround the port while bombers sink every ship that approaches. By May 28th, it's over. The British lose their entire professional army. Not just soldiers, but experienced officers, trained units, everything. Churchill is still prime minister, but now he's looking at a military catastrophe that makes Dunkirk a victory. Britain has almost no ground forces. The public is screaming for peace. And the generals running Germany know exactly how to exploit this. They don't plan Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain that Hitler was obsessed with. Because the generals know that's suicide. The Royal Navy is too strong. An amphibious invasion across the English Channel is nearly impossible. Hitler pushed for it anyway because he didn't understand logistics. Instead, the generals do what they always wanted to do. They focus on the Mediterranean. They send Erwin Rommel to North Africa with actual support. Not the skeleton force he got in our timeline, but a real army. Tanks, supplies, fuel, everything he needs. They pressure Franco to let them take Gibraltar. They push harder into Egypt. They threaten the Suez Canal. And here's the key. They don't break their agreement with the Soviet Union. At least not yet. This is where Hitler's ideology becomes the critical factor. In our timeline, Hitler attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. And it was driven almost entirely by ideology. Hitler hated communism. He hated Slavs. He wanted Lebensraum, living space for Germans. He thought the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. He was wrong about that last thing. Catastrophically wrong. But the generals knew it was a bad idea from the start. They told Hitler for months that attacking the Soviet Union while you're still at war with Britain is strategically insane. You don't fight a war on two fronts. That's like the first rule of warfare. Germany learned that lesson in World War I. Hitler didn't care. He wanted to attack, so they attacked. Without Hitler, that doesn't happen. At least not in 1941. The Military Council looks at the strategic situation in mid-1940, and they see it completely differently. Britain is wounded but not defeated. The Mediterranean is wide open. The Soviet Union is honoring the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, sending Germany oil and resources. Stalin is even congratulating them on their victories in France. Why would you attack that? So Germany doesn't attack Russia. At least not yet. Instead, they do what every military strategist says they should have done. They secure the Mediterranean. They take Gibraltar in late 1940 with Spanish cooperation. That cuts off British access to the Mediterranean. They pour resources into North Africa. Rommel pushes into Egypt with 3 times the force he had in our timeline. By early 1941, the Suez Canal is under German control. This is catastrophic for Britain. Suddenly, the route to India is cut off. Oil from the Middle East can't get through. The entire British position in the Mediterranean collapses. Malta falls without British naval support. The Royal Navy has to withdraw to Gibraltar, except Gibraltar is now in German hands. Churchill faces the worst strategic position Britain has been in for centuries, and the United States still isn't in the war. This is where it gets complicated. Would the United States still enter the war? In our timeline, America joined in December 1941 because Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That brought America into the Pacific War. Then Hitler, in one of his most baffling decisions, declared war on the United States 4 days later. He didn't have to do that. The tripartite pact with Japan didn't require it. But he did it anyway, probably because he thought it looked strong. That was possibly the worst strategic decision of the entire war. Without Hitler, Germany doesn't declare war on America. Japan still attacks Pearl Harbor because that's about their conflict with the United States over the Pacific, not about Germany. But now America is only fighting Japan. Roosevelt wants to help Britain, but Congress is divided. The isolationist movement is still strong. America is focused on the Pacific. Germany, meanwhile, offers Britain a peace deal. Not through Hitler's bizarre channels with his strange obsession about Britain joining against the Soviets, but through professional diplomatic channels. The terms are harsh, but not insane. Britain keeps its independence and its empire outside Europe. Germany keeps everything it's conquered. The Mediterranean is divided into spheres of influence. Churchill refuses, of course. He's Churchill, but the pressure on him is enormous. Britain is isolated. The Soviet Union is still neutral. America is fighting Japan. The British public has been at war for 2 years with nothing but defeats to show for it. Voices in Parliament are asking what they're actually fighting for at this point. And then Germany makes its move on the Soviet Union. This is the big one, because eventually, Germany attacks the Soviet Union anyway. The generals know they have to. Stalin is building up his military. The Soviets will be a threat eventually. Better to hit them while Germany is at peak strength. But the invasion that happens in this timeline is completely different. First, timing. In our timeline, Operation Barbarossa started on June 22, 1941. That gave Germany less than 5 months of good weather before the Russian winter. And Hitler delayed it by 5 weeks because he had to bail out Mussolini in Greece and Yugoslavia. In this timeline, Without Hitler's alliance with Italy being a personal friendship, Germany doesn't waste resources saving Mussolini's disasters. They don't invade Yugoslavia. They don't get bogged down in Greece. That means Operation Barbarossa can start in early May, maybe even late April. That's 6 to 7 months of good weather. Second, strategy. Hitler's plan for Barbarossa was unfocused. He wanted to take Leningrad for its symbolic value. He wanted Moscow because it was the capital. He wanted Ukraine for its resources. He constantly changed priorities, splitting German forces, creating confusion. The generals wanted to focus on Moscow. Take the capital, destroy the Soviet command structure, cut the country in half. That's basic military doctrine. You go for the enemy's center of gravity. So in this timeline, that's what they do. The entire weight of the German military pushes directly toward Moscow. 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, all aimed at one objective. And here's the terrifying part. It probably succeeds. The Red Army in 1941 wasn't ready for this. Stalin had purged most of his experienced officers in the late 1930s. Soviet military doctrine was confused. Their equipment was outdated. They had numerical superiority, but almost no coordination. In our timeline, the Red Army nearly collapsed in the first few months anyway. German forces encircled millions of Soviet soldiers. They got to within 20 miles of Moscow before winter, and Soviet reinforcements from Siberia stopped them. In this timeline, with better focus and an extra 6 weeks of good weather, German forces reach Moscow in September. The city falls in October. Stalin either dies fighting or flees to the Urals. The Soviet government disintegrates. Now, does that mean the Soviet Union surrenders? Not necessarily. Russia is huge. The Soviets can retreat east. They can keep fighting. But the psychological impact of losing Moscow is enormous. In our timeline, the fact that Moscow held became a rallying point for Soviet resistance. Here, that's gone. Let's talk about something we often forget. Technology. Because without Hitler's obsessive projects, Germany uses its resources completely differently. In our timeline, Hitler was obsessed with wonder weapons. V-2 rockets. Me-262 jet fighters. Massive tanks like the Tiger and Panther. These weapons were impressive, but they sucked up enormous amounts of resources that could have been spent on conventional armaments. The V-2 program alone cost as much as the Manhattan Project. Billions in today's dollars. And for what? They fired about 3,000 V-2 rockets at Britain. Killed about 9,000 people. That's horrible, but from a military standpoint, completely ineffective. Those resources could have been used to make 24,000 fighters, or 12,000 tanks, or millions of artillery shells. Hitler insisted on these projects because he loved the idea of superior German weapons. The generals knew it was a waste of resources. In this timeline, without Hitler forcing these projects, Germany focuses its industrial power on efficiency, makes more medium tanks instead of small numbers of massive beasts, focuses on proven technology instead of experimental projects. Their ammunition production doubles because they're not pouring money into rockets that can't hit anything. That also means the country runs out of critical resources more slowly. Germany was desperately short of oil throughout the war. Every liter was precious, and they were wasting it testing jet fighters that weren't ready for production and huge tanks that consumed twice as much fuel as standard models. The generals allocate resources rationally. That might not sound exciting, but in total war, that's the difference between winning and losing. Now we need to talk about Japan. Because in our timeline, the alliance between Germany and Japan was almost useless. They shared enemies, but they didn't coordinate strategy. They didn't share technology. They barely communicated. Part of that is geography. They're on opposite sides of the world. But part of it was also Hitler's racist views of the Japanese and his general disinterest in the Pacific. The generals see it differently. They see Japan as a useful ally pressuring the British and Americans from the other side. They want coordination. So in this timeline, Germany and Japan actually make a real alliance. They share intelligence. They coordinate strategy. They discuss joint operations. Most importantly, they talk about the Soviet Union. In our timeline, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the Soviets in April 1941 that freed Soviet troops in the Far East to transfer to the front against Germany. Those fresh Siberian divisions were what stopped the Germans outside Moscow in December 1941. In this timeline, Germany convinces Japan to attack the Soviet Union from the east. At the same time, Operation Barbarossa begins from the west. Japan had already fought the Soviets in 1939 at Kochan-Joel and lost. But that was before the Red Army was weakened by Stalin's purges and the German assault. Japan reluctantly agrees. They'd rather attack Britain and America in the south. But Germany offers technology, blueprints for their tanks, plans for their submarines, intelligence sharing. Now the Soviet Union is fighting on two fronts. 3 million Germans attacking from the west, 1 million Japanese attacking from the east. And they can't move their Siberian divisions because they're busy fighting Japan. Moscow falls a month earlier without those reinforcements. And now we come to the moment that defines this entire timeline. The point where history really diverges. January 1942. It's been 6 months since Moscow fell. The Soviet Union still exists, but it's broken. Their government has evacuated to Sverdlovsk, deep in the Urals. Stalin might still be leading. Maybe he's been replaced in a coup. Doesn't matter. What matters is that the Red Army no longer exists as a coherent fighting force. The British are isolated. Malta has fallen. Gibraltar is in German hands. The Suez Canal is under Axis control. North Africa has fallen. British naval power is still strong, but they have nowhere to use it in the Mediterranean. America is fighting Japan in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor happened. The Philippines are falling. But Germany hasn't declared war on America. Congress is divided about sending troops to Europe when the main enemy is Japan. Churchill is desperate. The Russians are crushed. The Americans are preoccupied. The British public is tired of war. People are starving from submarine blockades that are far more effective in this timeline because Germany hasn't squandered its resources on pointless projects. And then the offer comes. It doesn't come from Hitler, with his incoherent demands and bizarre obsessions. It comes from the military council running Germany. It comes through Swiss diplomatic channels. It comes formulated professionally. The terms are as follows. Britain keeps its independence, keeps its royal family, keeps its democratic government, keeps its navy, keeps its colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. But Europe belongs to Germany. Every territory they control stays under their control. France, Belgium, Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and now most of Russia. These are their spheres of influence. The Mediterranean is divided. North Africa belongs to the Axis. The Middle East is split between German and British zones. The Suez Canal becomes a neutral zone controlled by both sides. Most importantly, all prisoners of war are released. All British soldiers in German captivity come home. All sailors. All pilots. It's not a bad offer. In fact, from a British standpoint, it's an incredibly generous offer. It recognizes the British Empire. It allows Britain to keep its power. It only asks that Britain recognize the reality of the situation in Europe. Churchill looks at this offer and knows what it means. It means surrender. Maybe not formal, maybe not total, but surrender nonetheless. It means leaving all of Europe under Nazi control. It means abandoning millions of people to genocide. But it also means saving Britain. It means British people stop dying. It means ships with food start arriving again. It means mothers see their children again. And here's where it gets really dark. Because in our timeline, Churchill could refuse any peace offer because he knew help was coming. He knew America would enter the war. He knew the Soviets would hold. He had hope. In this timeline, there is no such hope. The Soviets are crushed. America isn't coming. Britain is alone. Parliament pressures him. Not traitors or fifth columnists, but patriots who see no path to victory. People like Lord Halifax, who wanted peace with Germany back in May 1940. People arguing that continuing the war means eventual British collapse with no chance of victory. Churchill refuses, of course. If it were only up to him, he'd fight to the last man. But he doesn't choose alone. Britain is a democracy, and democracies can't fight endless wars they can't win. By the summer of 1942, the pressure is unbearable. Maybe Churchill resigns. Maybe Parliament removes him. Maybe there's an election and he loses. The mechanism doesn't matter. The result does. Britain accepts peace. And what does America do? In our timeline, America became the arsenal of democracy. They produced weapons for Britain and the Soviet Union. They sent millions of soldiers to Europe. They entered the most massive industrial effort in history. But in our timeline, America did that because they were at war with Germany. Hitler declared war on them. They had no choice. In this timeline, Germany hasn't declared war on America. Technically, America and Germany aren't at war. They're at war with Japan. That's a completely different situation. Roosevelt wants to help. He sees the danger of Nazi Europe. But Congress isn't convinced. The American people aren't convinced. They just lost 2,000 sailors at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese are bombing American bases. The Philippines are falling. Guam is captured. Wake Island falls. The Pacific War is all-consuming. The European war seems far away. And then Britain makes peace with Germany. That changes everything. If Britain, which has been at war for 3 years, has given up, why would America enter? To avenge European nations that can't defend themselves? The isolationist movement explodes. They point to British peace as proof that Europe isn't America's problem. They say America should focus on defeating Japan, then come home. Roosevelt tries. He gives speeches. He warns of the danger. He talks about how Nazi Europe will be a threat to America for decades. But without Britain fighting, without the Soviets tying down millions of German soldiers, without an immediate threat, it's a hard sell. America might never send massive forces to Europe. They focus on the Pacific. They defeat Japan by 1944 or 1945. And then they face a world where Nazi Germany rules Europe. Now we enter the period from 1942 to 1945 in this timeline. The war is over in Europe. Peace has been achieved. What does Germany do? First, they consolidate their control. Occupation isn't easy. Resistance movements exist throughout Europe. French partisans, Polish underground, Yugoslav partisans. These movements were problematic in our timeline even while Germany was burdened with a massive war. Now, with peace, Germany can devote full resources to crushing resistance. And they're brutal. Without Hitler's impulsive decisions, but with German efficiency. The generals running Germany aren't softer than Hitler. They're just more rational. They use systematic terror instead of random terror. For every German soldier killed, 50 hostages are executed. Not 100 as Hitler sometimes ordered in a frenzy, which just created more resistance fighters. 50 is enough to deter future attacks, but not so much it causes total rebellion. It's calculated. It's cold. It's effective. Resistance is slowly crushed. Not completely. Never completely. But enough that occupation becomes sustainable. Second, they reorganize Eastern Europe. In our timeline, the plan was General Plan Ost. Deportation or extermination of most of Eastern Europe's population. Colonization by German settlers. That was Hitler's plan, and it was insane. Logistically impossible. Economically senseless. The generals do something different. Still horrible. Still genocidal. But in a different way. They identify resource-rich areas. Ukraine with its agricultural land. Romania with its oil. The Baltic states with their ports. These areas get preferential treatment. Local populations that cooperate can stay. They'll work for the Germans, but they won't be mass murdered or deported. Areas without strategic value face worse fates. Western Poland is Germanized. The population is forcibly resettled. German settlers take over. It's still genocide. It's still mass murder. But it's focused enough to be logistically possible. And that. Third, they work with their satellite states differently than Hitler did. In our timeline, Hitler treated allies as subordinates. He humiliated them. He ignored their interests. That created resentment and instability. The generals are more pragmatic. They understand they'll need local governments to manage these vast territories. They can't put a German governor in every village from France to the Urals. So they create a real system of satellite states. France gets a pro-German government, but with actual autonomy in internal affairs. Pétain or someone like him runs the country. The Germans control foreign policy and military matters. The French economy is integrated into the German one. But the French are allowed to run their schools, their culture, their social life. It's not freedom. It's not democracy. But it's enough that most French people accept the situation. Especially after 3 years of war and deprivation. People want normalcy. They want their children safe. They want enough food. The Germans provide that. The same model applies across occupied Europe. Norway gets Quisling or a similar leader. Holland gets German sympathizers in positions of power. Belgium is divided between Flemish and Walloon administrations, both loyal to Berlin. Eastern Europe is different. There, German control is more direct, more brutal. But even there, they use local collaborators. Ukrainian nationalists who hate Russians more than they hate Germans. Baltic fascists who see Germans as liberators from the Soviets. Hungarian and Romanian governments who want a share of the spoils. By 1943, Nazi Europe isn't a chaotic occupation characterized by constant struggle. It's a functional, if monstrous, system. A system that looks like it could last. Let's talk about the economy. Because in our timeline, one reason Germany lost was economic. They simply didn't have the resources to wage total war against three world powers simultaneously. In this timeline, the situation is different. First, Germany now controls vast territories. The entire industrial capacity of France, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Western Poland. The agricultural resources of Ukraine, called the breadbasket of Europe. Romanian oil from the Ploiești fields. Swedish iron ore. Norwegian aluminum and hydropower for steel production. In our timeline, Germany controlled most of this, but they spent it all on war. Factories were bombed by the Allies. Infrastructure was destroyed in fighting. Workers were conscripted into the army or worked in terrible concentration camp conditions. Here, with peace in Europe, all of this can be organized efficiently. French factories produce for the German economy. Polish mines dig coal. Ukrainian farmers grow food. It all goes into one integrated economic system centered in Berlin. And it doesn't require as much force as you might think. Most people, most of the time, just want to work, earn a wage, and feed their families. If you let them do that, they'll cooperate even with a system they despise. The Germans do this smarter than in our timeline. They pay decent wages. Not enough to be generous, but enough that people survive. They maintain public services. They run trains on time. They keep factories safe. Everything is terribly organized and efficient. And for the Jewish population and others the regime considers undesirable, the Holocaust still happens. Concentration camps still operate. Gas chambers at Auschwitz still kill thousands daily. This is perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this timeline. Because without the chaos of war diverting resources and attention, the Nazi genocide machinery works even more efficiently. In our timeline, many Jews survive because they hid in the chaos, because some brave people sheltered them, because German resources were stretched. Here, with peace and efficient administration, the system is deadlier. Now we enter the 1943 to 1945 period. The war is over in Europe, but America is still out there. And they're working on something that will change everything. The atomic bomb. In our timeline, the Manhattan Project was an Allied effort. American resources, British scientists, even some refugee European physicists who escaped from the Nazis. The goal was to get the bomb before the Germans. In this timeline, things are more complicated. First, many of those European scientists didn't escape. In our timeline, people like Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, Enrico Fermi, all left because they were Jewish or opposed fascism or were in danger. They went to Britain or America. But in this timeline, the chaos was shorter. The war ended earlier. Some of those scientists were caught before they could escape. Some stayed thinking they could survive. Some were killed. That means the American Manhattan Project has fewer scientists. It's not impossible to succeed, but it's slower. Meanwhile, what is Germany doing? In our timeline, the German nuclear program was a disaster. Wrong approach. Insufficient resources. Hitler ignored it because he didn't understand physics. But the generals running Germany in this timeline aren't Hitler. When their scientists tell them an atomic bomb is theoretically possible, they listen. They allocate resources. They put Werner Heisenberg, a Nobel Prize winner, in charge of the program with real support. A race begins. America works on its bomb. Germany works on its own. Both sides know that whoever gets atomic weapons first can dictate terms to the entire world. America has advantages. Enormous industrial capacity. Safety from bombing. Access to uranium mines in the Congo through the Belgian government in exile that cooperates. But Germany also has advantages. The Norwegian heavy water plant at Vemork, essential for plutonium production. Check uranium mines. And most importantly, peace in Europe means they can devote full resources to the project without BOM. We can't forget what's happening in Russia. Because the Soviet Union technically still exists, it's just a fragile shadow of what it was. After Moscow fell in late 1941, the Soviet government retreated deep into the Ural Mountains. Maybe Stalin still leads. Maybe he was removed in a coup. Maybe he's even dead. For the purposes of this scenario, let's say he survives, but his authority is weakened. What remains of the Red Army is fragmented. They still have millions of men under arms, but without coordination, without central command. Some generals hold territories. Others establish effective warlord states. It's chaos. Germany offers them peace in the spring of 1942. The terms are clear. The Soviet Union recognizes German control over all of European Russia west of a line running roughly along the Volga River. That means Moscow, Leningrad, now under siege for years, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, everything. The Soviets can keep Siberia, Central Asia, the Far East. That's still enormous territory. But it's land without most of its population, without its industry, without its agriculture. To some Soviet leaders, this looks like salvation. They've lost the war. Continuing to fight means eventual total collapse. Accepting peace means at least something of the Soviet Union survives. Others want to keep fighting. They point to the vast expanses of Siberia. They can retreat further. They can form new defenses in the Ural Mountains. They can wait. Discussions in the Soviet leadership are fierce. In the end, the pragmatic faction wins. Maybe not because they think it's right, but because they have no choice. Without American aid, which isn't coming in this timeline, without the ability to defend themselves, they accept. By mid-1942, the Soviet Union signs an armistice with Germany. It's not a formal peace. Both sides see it as temporary. But effectively, the war on the Eastern Front is over. Millions of Soviet citizens now live under German occupation. And what happens to them is too horrible to describe. General Plan Ost, the plan for depopulation and Germanization of Eastern Europe, is implemented in modified form. Millions die from starvation, disease, executions. Others are forcibly resettled. Some become slave labor. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of this timeline. In our timeline, the Soviet Union suffered terrible losses but eventually liberated its territories. Here, that liberation never comes. Let's return to Germany's internal politics. Because while the military council takes over after Hitler's death in September 1939, that doesn't mean political struggle is over. Goering, Himmler, various factions within the military, they're all still fighting for influence. The military council might control operations, but daily administration of a vast empire requires a bureaucratic system. And that's where conflicts come. Goering controls the Luftwaffe and the economy. He was in charge of the 4-year plan. Himmler controls the SS and police. The Wehrmacht controls the army. These power centers constantly clash. In our timeline, Hitler was the arbiter of these conflicts. He made final decisions, however chaotic. Here, there's no final authority. Military councils decide by vote or consensus, which is slower and creates factions. By 1943, clear groups are forming. An Eastern faction of generals who fought in Russia and want continued expansion eastward. A Western faction that thinks they should consolidate what they have and focus on the Atlantic. An SS faction under Himmler that wants ideological purity. An economic faction that wants pragmatic trade and development. These conflicts can be destabilizing, but they also make the regime adaptable in ways Hitler's dictatorship wasn't. Different ideas are tested. Policies are adjusted based on results. It's not democracy, far from it. But it's not the total totalitarianism of one person either. Now we move into the post-war period. What does the world look like in the late 1940s in this timeline? Europe is divided. Nazi Germany rules from the Atlantic to the Volga. It's the largest empire Europe has seen since the Roman Empire. Within that empire, millions live under brutal occupation. The Holocaust happened. Millions of Jews, Roma, Slavs, political dissidents, all dead. Generations erased. But on the surface, to someone observing from outside, it looks stable. Trains run. Factories operate. People go to work. There's a culture of conformism and fear that keeps most people in line. Britain is isolated. It kept its empire, but the loss of influence in Europe is staggering. It begins to look more toward its colonies. The relationship with America is complicated. Americans see them as those who gave up. America is the dominant power in the Pacific and the Americas. They defeated Japan, probably using atomic bombs. If they get them first, that race is still critical. But they didn't intervene in Europe. There's enormous debate in American politics about whether that was the right decision. Some say they should have fought. Others say it would have been throwing American lives at a European problem. The Soviet Union, or what remains of it, controls Siberia and the Far East. It's a shadow of its former self. Maybe it's slowly rebuilding. Maybe it's further fragmenting into regional powers. It's a question without a clear answer. Japan is defeated, probably occupied by America, as in our timeline. China is going through its civil war between communists and nationalists. In our timeline, the communists won. In this timeline, without Soviet support, because the Soviet Union is too weak, maybe the nationalists win. Or maybe the war lasts longer. The Middle East is unstable. The Germans control the northern parts. The British control the southern parts. Local nationalist movements are rebelling against both. Oil has become a critical resource, and everyone is fighting for control. Here's the biggest question. Can this Nazi European order actually survive long-term? Arguments for. Empires throughout history have lasted centuries. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. With enough military, enough bureaucracy, enough economic integration, maybe it's possible. Arguments against. The Nazi regime is fundamentally based on violence and oppression. You can't keep millions of people under your boot forever. Eventually, resistance grows. Eventually, the economy breaks down under the burden of maintaining a massive system of control. Historical evidence suggests that regimes based on terror aren't stable long-term. The Soviet Union eventually collapsed. Many dictatorships of the 20th century fell. Can Nazi Europe be different? Maybe. If they manage to maintain a certain level of economic prosperity. If they manage to integrate satellite peoples into a system where they have something to lose. If they manage to present external threats, America, the remnant Soviets, whoever, as a reason why people must stay united. But that requires sophisticated propaganda, careful economic policy, and the ability to adapt. The question is whether the military regime running Germany in this timeline has that kind of capability. One scenario is that the regime gradually liberalizes. Not quickly, not obviously, but slowly. Less brutality, more local autonomy. Focus on economic development instead of ideological purity. By the 1970s or 1980s, maybe you have something that looks more like an authoritarian European Union than a purely fascist empire. Another scenario is that it falls apart. Resistance movements are never fully extinguished. Economic crises hit. Power struggles in Berlin worsen. Satellite states begin to break away. By the 1960s or 1970s, the whole thing collapses into a series of regional wars. A third scenario, perhaps the most terrifying, is that it becomes permanent, that the Nazi regime normalizes, that a new generation grows up knowing nothing else, that the Holocaust becomes something people know about but rarely discuss, like genocides throughout history, and that by the 21st century, Nazi Europe is just a fact of the world order, like any other power. Now we need to be strictly honest with the counterarguments, because there are many historians who think this scenario is impossible no matter when Hitler dies. First argument. Germany was always doomed to lose because of resources. Against three great powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, America, Germany simply didn't have the industrial capacity. Even with all of Europe under control, they couldn't match the combined production of America and the Soviet Union. This is a strong argument. American industrial production in World War II was incredible. They produced more ships, more planes, more tanks than everyone else combined. The Soviets produced over 80,000 tanks during the war. Germany, even with occupied Europe, couldn't compete with those numbers. But the counter argument is, in this timeline, Germany isn't fighting all three at once. They knock Britain out early. They defeat the Soviets before their industry is fully mobilized. They never fight America directly. That might be enough. Second argument, Nazi ideology was inherently self-destructive. The Holocaust wasted resources they could have used for the war. Treatment of occupied peoples created resistance that required enormous military forces to suppress. Racial policies alienated potential allies, like Ukrainian nationalists who initially welcomed Germans as liberators. This is also a strong argument. In our timeline, the Nazi regime was killing people it could have used as workers. Brutality toward Slavs turned people who might have cooperated into fierce opponents. Ideological purity trumped pragmatic efficiency. But the counterargument is, What if the generals are pragmatic enough to modify those policies? Not abolish the Holocaust. The Nazi regime is still genocidal. But maybe they treat occupied populations slightly better if they cooperate. Maybe they don't waste resources on unnecessary brutality. Maybe they make alliances with local fascist movements that share their goals. That doesn't make the regime less evil, but it might make it sustainable. Third argument. Hitler actually wasn't as bad a strategist as people think. Many of the decisions we see as mistakes had rationale at the time. The halt at Dunkirk was partly due to concerns that the terrain was bad for tanks. Attacking the Soviet Union was based on intelligence assessments, wrong ones, that the Soviets would collapse quickly. Declaring war on America was honoring the alliance with Japan. This is the weakest argument, in my opinion, because while some of Hitler's decisions had reasoning behind them, many were obviously bad even with the information available at the time. His generals constantly told him he was wrong. Halder kept a diary documenting how Hitler overruled them. Guderian, Manstein, Rommel all criticized Hitler's decisions. But the point is valid that removing Hitler doesn't automatically make Germany wise. Generals make mistakes too. Maybe different mistakes, but mistakes nonetheless. We need to return to the critical moment. The moment that defines whether this timeline can actually happen. That's the winter of 1941 to 42. German tanks have reached the outskirts of Moscow. The temperature is dropping. Soviet reinforcements are arriving. This is the moment when, in our timeline, the German advance stopped. In our timeline, they stopped because of a combination of factors. Hitler divided forces between multiple objectives. The logistical network was overextended. Soviet resistance was fiercer than expected. The winter was early and brutal. In this timeline, all of that is different, but only slightly. The Germans are focused exclusively on Moscow. That means they have maybe 20% more forces concentrated on one point. Their logistics are better because they're not trying to supply 3 different axes of attack. They started 6 weeks earlier, which gives them more time before winter hits. But the Soviets are still Soviets. They have unlimited manpower. Their soldiers fight desperately on the approaches to their capital. Zhukov, one of the best Soviet generals, commands the defense. So the question becomes, is 20% more German forces and 6 more weeks enough? Honestly, historians are divided. Some say yes, some say no. It's so close it could go either way. But for the purposes of this scenario, let's say it is. Let's say the Germans capture Moscow in October 1941. Not because it's guaranteed, but because it's possible. And with Moscow captured, the psychological shock ripples through the Soviet Union. Command and control breaks down. Front lines begin to collapse. By December, the situation is catastrophic. Stalin faces the worst decision of his life. Continue fighting from the Urals and maybe lose everything. Or make peace, save what he can, and live to fight another day. What would he choose? In our timeline, he never had to make that decision because the Soviets defended Moscow. But here, with the city fallen, the question becomes real. And that's why this is the most interesting part of this timeline. Not because we think the Nazis should win, but because it shows how close they came, how few things needed to be different. So could Nazi Germany have won World War II without Hitler? The real answer is, probably not, but maybe. Everything we've discussed requires things to go perfectly for Germany. It requires Hitler's death to lead to a military council that's both competent and able to work together. It requires Dunkirk to be a complete victory. It requires the Soviets to collapse faster than in our timeline. It requires America not to enter the European war. It requires a lot of luck. But it's not impossible. That's what makes this scenario so disturbing. We live in a world where the Nazis lost, where their crimes were exposed, where the Holocaust became a warning for all future generations about the dangers of hatred and totalitarianism. We live in a world where we can say, see, evil was defeated. Justice prevailed. But this scenario reminds us that victory wasn't inevitable, that the outcome of World War II depended not just on the courage and sacrifice of millions, but also on Hitler's mistakes. Remove those mistakes, and history might go very differently. The scariest part isn't that the generals would be smarter than Hitler. The scariest part is that they wouldn't need to be much smarter. They just need to be competent, understand basic military strategy, not make catastrophic mistakes that were obvious even to people at the time. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If the Nazis lost partly because of their own incompetence, Does that mean evil is inherently self-destructive? Or were we, perhaps, just lucky? I think the answer is somewhere in between. Evil is often self-destructive because it requires maintaining a system of violence that's exhausting and destabilizing. But evil can also be competent, at least for a while. History is full of examples of authoritarian regimes that lasted for decades. The difference comes from resistance. From people who refuse to accept tyranny. From soldiers who fight against it. From ordinary citizens who risk everything to shelter Jews or other persecuted populations. From alliances between democracies that stand together against fascism. In our timeline, those things succeeded. Soviet resistance held long enough for the Allies to mobilize. The British refused to surrender even when it looked hopeless. America entered the war and threw its industrial might into the balance. In this timeline, those things don't succeed. Not because of cowardice or lack of courage, but because of timing and circumstances. Hitler dies at the wrong moment. The generals make the right decisions. Luck falls on the German side. And the result is a world where the Holocaust succeeded. Where millions who survived in our timeline die. Where the Nazi regime becomes a permanent feature of the European landscape. That's a dark imagination. But it's useful, because it reminds us what was at stake. It reminds us why the people who fought against Nazism considered it worth dying for. It reminds us that history isn't inevitable, but shaped by decisions, courage, and sometimes, chance. We live in a world where the Nazis were defeated. That didn't happen by accident. It came at the cost of millions of lives. It came from soldiers who died on the beaches of Normandy, in the streets of Stalingrad, in the skies above Britain. It came from an alliance that held together even when it looked like they would lose. And this scenario reminds us how precious that outcome is, how easily it could have been different, and why we must protect the democracy, human rights, and rule of law that defeated fascism in our world. Because in another world, with just a few changes, fascism could have won. If you want to see more alternate history scenarios, hit that subscribe button.